The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsay. Part 1. Chapter 1. The Plan of the Parliament of Erle. In their ruddy jackets of leather that reached to their knees, the men of Erle appeared before their lord, the stately white-haired man in his long red room. He leaned in his carven chair and heard their spokesman, and thus their spokesman said, "For 700 years the chiefs of your race have ruled us well, and their deeds are remembered by the minor minstrels, living on yet in their little tinkling songs. And yet the generations stream away, and there is no new thing." "What would you?" said the Lord. "We would be ruled by a magic lord," they said. "So be it," said the Lord. "It is 500 years since my people have spoken thus in Parliament, and it shall always be as your Parliament saith. You have spoken, so be it." And he raised his hand and blessed them, and they went. They went back to their ancient crafts, to the fitting of iron to the hooves of horses, to working upon leather, to tending flowers, to ministering to the rugged needs of earth. They followed the ancient ways and looked for a new thing. But the old lord sent a word to his eldest son, bidding him come before him. And very soon the young man stood before him in the same carven chair from which he had not moved, where light growing late from high windows showed the aged eyes looking far into the future beyond that old lord's time, and seated there he gave his son his commandment. "Go forth," he said, "before these days of mine are over, and therefore go in haste, and go from here eastward and past the fields we know, till you see the lands that clearly pertain to Fairy, and cross their boundary, which is made of twilight, and come to that palace that is only told of in song." "It is far from here," said the young man Alveric. "Yes," answered he, "it is far." "And further still," the young man said, "to return, for distances in those fields are not as here." "Even so," said his father. "What do you bid me do," said the son, "when I come to that palace?" And his father said, "To wed the King of Elfland's daughter." The young man thought of her beauty and crown of ice, and the sweetness that fabulous runes had told was hers. Songs were sung of her on wild hills where tiny strawberries grew, at dusk and by early starlight, and if one sought the singer no man was there. Sometimes only her name was sung softly over and over. Her name was Lirazel. She was a princess of the magic line. The gods had sent their shadows to her christening, and the fairies too would have gone, but they were frightened to see in their dewy fields the long, dark, moving shadows of the gods, so they stayed hidden in crowds of pale pink anemones, and thence blessed Lirazel. "My people demand a magic lord rule over them. They have chosen foolishly," the old lord said, "and only the dark ones that show not their faces know all that this will bring. But we, who see not, follow the ancient custom and do what our people in the Parliament say. It may be some spirit of wisdom they have not known may save them even yet. Go then, with your face turned towards that light that beats from fairyland, and that faintly illuminates the dust between sunset and early stars, and this shall guide you till you come to the frontier and have passed the fields we know." Then he unbuckled a strap and a girdle of leather, and gave his huge sword to his son, saying, "This that has brought our family down the ages until this day shall surely guard you always upon your journey, even though you fare beyond the fields we know." And the young man took it, though he never knew that such a sword could avail him. Near the castle of Earl there lived a lonely witch, on high land near the thunder, which used to roll in summer along the hills. There she dwelt by herself in a narrow cottage of thatch, and roamed the high fields alone to gather the thunderbolts. Of these thunderbolts, that had no earthly forging, were made, with suitable runes, such weapons as had to parry unearthly dangers. And alone would roam this witch at certain tides of spring, taking the form of a young girl in her beauty, singing among tall flowers in gardens of Earl. She would go at the hour when hawk moths first pass from bell to bell, and of those few that had seen her was this son of the Lord of Earl. And though it was a calamity to love her, though it wrapped men's thoughts away from all things true, yet the beauty of the form that was not hers had lured him to gaze at her with deep young eyes, till, whether flattery or pity moved her, who knows that is mortal, she spared him whom her arts might well have destroyed, and changed instantly in that garden there, showed him the rightful form of a deadly witch. And even then his eyes did not at once forsake her, and in the moment that his glance still lingered upon that withered shape that haunted the hollyhocks, she had her gratitude that may not be bought, nor won by any charms that Christians knew. And she had beckoned to him, and he had followed, and learned from her on her thunder-haunted hill that on the day of need a sword might be made of metals not sprung from earth, with runes along it that would waft away certainly any thrust of earthly sword, and except for 3 master runes could thwart the weapons of Elfland. As he took his father's sword, the young man thought of the witch. It was scarcely dark in the valley when he left the castle of Earl, and went so swiftly up the Witch's Hill that a dim light lingered yet on its highest heaths, when he came near the cottage of the one he sought, and found her burning bones at a fire in the open. To her he said that the day of his need was come, and she bade him gather thunderbolts in her garden in the soft earth under her cabbages. And there, with eyes that saw every minute more dimly, and fingers that grew accustomed to the thunderbolt's curious surfaces, he found before darkness came down on him 17, and these he heaped into silken handkerchief and carried them back to the witch. On the grass beside her he laid these strangers to earth. From wonderful spaces they came to her magical garden, shaken by thunder from paths that we cannot tread, and though not in themselves containing magic, were well adapted to carry what magic her runes could give. She laid the thigh bone of a materialist down, and turned to those stormy wanderers. She arranged them in one straight row by the side of her fire, and over them then she toppled the burning logs and the embers, prodding them down with an ebon stick, that is, the sceptre of witches, until she had deeply covered those 17 cousins of earth that had visited us from their ethereal home. She stepped back then from her fire and stretched out her hands and suddenly blasted it with a frightful rune. The flames leaped up in amazement, and what had been but a lonely fire in the night, with no more mystery than pertains to all such fires, flared suddenly into a thing that the wanderers feared. As the green flames stung by her runes, leapt up, and the heat of the fire grew intenser. She stepped backwards further and further, and merely uttered her runes a little louder the further she got from the fire. She bade Alveric pile on logs, dark logs of oak that lay there cumbering the heath. And at once, as he dropped them on, the heat licked them up, and the witch went on pronouncing her louder runes. And the flames danced wild and green, and down in the embers the 17 whose paths had once crossed earth's, when they wandered free, knew heat again, as great as they had known even on that desperate ride that had brought them here. And when Alveric could no longer come near the fire, and the witch was some yards from it, shouting her runes, the magical flames burned all the ashes away, and that portent that flared on the hill as suddenly ceased, leaving only a circle that sullenly glowed on the ground, like the evil pool that glares where thermite has burst. And flat in the glow, all liquid, lay the sword. The witch approached it and pared its edges with the sword that she drew from her thigh. Then she sat down beside it on the earth and sang to it while it cooled. Not like the runes that enraged the flames was the song she sang to the sword, she whose curses had blasted the fire till it shriveled big logs of oak, crooned now a melody like a wind in summer blowing from wild wood gardens that no man tended, down valleys loved once by children, now lost to them but for dreams, a song of such memories as lurk and hide along the edges of oblivion, now flashing from beautiful years, a glimpse of some golden moment, now passing swiftly out of remembrance again, to go back to the shades of oblivion, and leaving on the mind those faintest traces of little shining feet, which, when dimly perceived by us, are called regrets. She sang of old summer noons in the time of harebells. She sang on that high dark heath a song that seemed so full of mornings and evenings, preserved with all their dues by her magical craft from days that had else been lost, that Alveric wondered of each small wandering wing that her fire had lured from the dusk. If this were the ghost of some day lost to man, called up by the force of her song from times that were fairer, and all the while the unearthly metal grew harder. The white liquid stiffened and turned red, the glow of the red dwindled, and as it cooled it narrowed, little particles came together, little crevices closed, and as they closed they seized the air about them, and with the air they caught the witch's rune, and gripped it and held it forever. And so it was, it became a magical sword. And little magic there is in English woods. From the time of anemones to the falling of leaves, that was not in the sword. And the little magic there is in southern downs, that only sheep roam over, and quiet shepherds that the sword had not to. And there was the scent of thyme in it, and the sight of lilac, and the chorus of birds that sings before dawn in April, and the deep proud splendour of rhododendrons, and the litheness and laughter of streams, and miles of May, and by the time the sword was black it was all enchanted with magic. Nobody could tell you about that sword, all that there is to be told of it, for those that know of those paths of space on which its metals once floated, till earth caught them one by one as she sailed past in her orbit, have little time to waste on such things as magic, and so cannot tell you how the sword was made. And those who know whence poetry is, and the need that man has for song, or know any one of the 50 branches of magic, have little time to waste on such things as science, and so cannot tell you whence its ingredients came. Enough that it was once beyond our earth, and was now here among the mundane stones, that it was once but as these stones, and now had something in it, such as soft music has. Let those that can define it. And now the witch drew the blade forth by the hilt, which was thick and on one side rounded, for she had cut a small groove in the soil below the hilt for this purpose, and began to sharpen both sides of the sword by rubbing them with a curious greenish stone, still singing over the sword an eerie song. Alveric watched her in silence, wondering, not counting time. It may have been for moments, it may have been while the stars went far on their courses. Suddenly she was finished. She stood up with the sword lying on both her hands. She stretched it out curtly to Alveric. He took it. She turned away, and there was a look in her eyes as though she would have kept that sword, or kept Alveric. He turned to pour out his thanks, but she was gone. He rapped on the door of the dark house. He called, "Witch, witch," along the lonely heath, till children heard on far farms and were terrified. Then he turned home, and that was best for him. Chapter 2. Alveric comes in sight of the Elfin mountains. To the long chamber, sparsely furnished, high in a tower, in which Alveric slept, there came a ray direct from the rising sun. He awoke and remembered at once the magical sword, which made all his awakening joyous. It is natural to feel glad at the thought of receiving a gift, but there was also a certain joy in the sword itself, which perhaps could communicate with Alveric's thoughts all the more easily, just as they came from Dreamland, which was preeminently the sword's own country. But, however it be, all those that have come by a magical sword have always felt that joy, while it was still new, clearly and unmistakably. He had no farewells to make, but thought it better instantly to obey his father's command than to stay to explain why he took upon his adventurous sword that he deemed to be better than the one his father loved. So he stayed not even to eat, but put food in a wallet and slung over him by a strap a bottle of good new leather, not waiting to fill it, for he knew he should meet with streams, and wearing his father's sword as swords are commonly worn, he slung the other over his back, with its rough hilt tied near his shoulder, and strode away from the castle and vale of Earl. Of money he took but little, half a handful of copper only, for use in the fields we know, for he knew not what coin or what means of exchange were used on the other side of the frontier of twilight. Now the Vale of Earl is very near the border beyond which there is none of the fields we know. He climbed the hill and strode over the fields and passed through woods of hazel, and the blue sky shone on him merrily as he went by the way of the fields, and the blue was as bright by his feet when he came to the woods, for it was the time of the bluebells. He ate and filled his water bottle and travelled all day eastward, and at evening the mountains of Fairy came floating into view, the colour of pale forget-me-nots. As the sun set behind Alveric, he looked up at those pale blue mountains to see what colours their peaks would astonish the evening, but never a tint they took from the setting sun, whose splendour was gliding all over the fields we know. Never a wrinkle faded upon their precipices, never a shadow deepened, and Alveric learned that for nothing that happens here is any change on the enchanted lands. He turned his eyes from their serene pale beauty back to the fields we know, and then, with their gables lifting into the sunlight above deep hedgerows, beautiful with spring, he saw the cottages of earthly men. Past them he walked while the beauty of evening grew, with songs of birds and scents wandering from flowers, and odours that deepened and deepened, and evening decked herself to receive the evening star. But before that star appeared, the young adventurer found the cottage he sought, for, flapping above its doorways, he saw the sign of a huge brown hide with outlandish letters in gilt, which proclaimed the dweller below to be a worker in leather. An old man came to the door when Alveric knocked, little and bent with age, and he bent more when Alveric named himself. And the young man asked for a scabbard for his sword, yet said not what sword it was. And they both went into the cottage where the old wife was by her big fire, and the couple did honour to Alveric. The old man sat down near his thick table, whose surface shone with smoothness wherever it was not pitted by little tools that had drilled through pieces of leather all that man's lifetime and in the times of his fathers. And then he laid the sword upon his knees and wondered at the roughness of the hilt and the guard, for they were raw unworked metal, and at the huge width of the sword. And then he screwed up his eyes and began to think of his trade, and in a while he thought out what must be done, and his wife bought him a fine hide, and he marked out on 2 pieces as wide as the sword and a bit wider than that. And any questions he had concerning that wide, bright sword Alveric somewhat parried, for he wished not to perplex his mind by telling him all that it was. He perplexed that old couple enough a little later when he asked them for lodging for the night. And this they gave him with as many apologies as if it were they that had been asked a favour, and gave him a great supper out of their cauldron, in which boiled everything that the old man snared. But nothing that Alveric was able to say prevented them from giving up their bed to him and preparing a heap of skins for their own night's rest by the fire. And after their supper the old man cut out the 2 wide pieces of leather with a point at the end of each, and began to stitch them together on either side. And then Alveric began to ask him of the way, and the old leather worker spoke of north and south and west, and even of northeast, but of east or southeast he spoke never a word. He dwelt near the very edge of the fields we know, yet of any hint of anything lying beyond them he and his wife said nothing. Where Alveric's journey lay upon the morrow, they seemed to think the world ended. And pondering afterwards, in the bed they gave him, all that the old man had said, Alveric sometimes marvelled at his ignorance, and yet sometimes wondered if it might have been skill by which those 2 had avoided all the evening any word of anything lying to the east or southeast of their home. He wondered if in his early days the old man might have gone there, but he was unable even to wonder what he had found there if he had gone. Then Alveric fell asleep, and dreams gave him hints and guesses of the old man's wanderings in fairyland, but gave him no better guides than he had already, and these were the pale blue peaks of the Elfin mountains. The old man woke him after he had slept long. When he came to the day room, a bright fire was burning there. His breakfast was ready for him, and the scabbard made, which fitted the sword exactly. The old people waited on him silently and took payment for the scabbard, but would not take aught for their hospitality. Silently they watched him rise to go, and followed him without a word to the door, and outside it watched him still, clearly hoping that he would turn to the north or the west. But when he turned and strode for the Elfin mountains, they watched him no more, for their faces never were turned that way. And though they watched him no longer, yet he waved his hand in farewell, for he had a feeling for the cottages and the fields of these simple folk, such as they had not for the enchanted lands. He walked in the sparkling morning, through scenes familiar from infancy. He saw the ruddy orchis flowing early, reminding the bluebells they were just past their prime. The small young leaves of the oak were yet a brownish yellow. The new beech leaves shone like brass, where the cuckoo was calling clearly, and a birch tree looked like a wild woodland creature that had draped herself in green gauze. On favoured bushes there were buds of May. Alveric said over and over to himself, farewell to all these things. The cuckoo went on calling, and not for him. And then, as he pushed through a hedge into a field untended, there suddenly, close before him in the field was, as his father had told, the frontier of twilight. It stretched across the field in front of him, blue and dense like water, and things seen through it seemed misshapen and shining. He looked back once over the fields we know. The cuckoo went on calling unconcernedly. A small bird sang about its own affairs, and nothing seeming to answer or heed his farewells, Alveric strode on boldly into those long masses of twilight. A man in a field not far was calling to horses. There were folk talking in a neighbouring lane as Alveric stepped into the rampart of twilight. At once all these sounds grew dim, humming faintly, as from great distances. In a few strides he was through, and not a murmur at all came then from the fields we know. The fields through which he had come had suddenly ended. There was no trace of its hedges bright with new green. He looked back, and the frontier seemed lowering, cloudy and smoky. He looked all around and saw no familiar thing. In the place of the beauty of May were the wonders and splendours of Elfland. The pale blue mountains stood august in their glory, shimmering and rippling in a golden light that seemed as though it rhythmically poured from the peaks and flooded all these slopes with breezes of gold. And below them, far off as yet, he saw going up all silver into the air the spires of the palace, only told of in song. He was on a plain on which the flowers were queer and the shape of the trees monstrous. He started at once towards the silver spires. To those who may have wisely kept their fancies within the boundary of the fields we know, it is difficult for me to tell of the lands to which Alveric had come, so that in the minds they can see a great plain with its scattered trees, and far off the dark wood out of which the place of Elfland lifted those glittering spires, and above them and beyond them that serene range of mountains whose pinnacles took no colour from any light we see. Yet it is for this very purpose that our fancies travel far, and if my reader through fault of mine fail to picture the peaks of Elfland, my fancy had better have stayed in the fields we know. Know then that in Elfland are colours more deep than are in our fields, and the very air there glows with so deep a lucency that all things seen there have some of the look of our trees and flowers in June reflected in water. And the colour of Elfland, of which I despaired to tell, may yet be told, for we have hints of it here. The deep blue of the night in summer, just as the gloaming has gone, the pale blue of Venus flooding the evening with light, the deep lakes in the twilight, all these are hints of that colour. And while our sunflowers carefully turn to the sun, some forefather of the rhododendrons must have turned a little towards Elfland, so that some of that glory dwells with them to this day. And above all, our painters have had many a glimpse of that country, so that sometimes in pictures we see a glamour too wonderful for our fields. It is a memory of theirs that intruded from some old glimpse of the pale blue mountains while they sat at easels painting in the fields we know. Sir Alveric strode on through the luminous air of that land, whose glimpses dimly remembered are inspirations here. And at once he felt less lonely, for there is a barrier in the field we know, drawn sharply between men and all other life, so that if we be but a day away from our kind we are lonely, but once across the boundary of twilight, and Alveric saw this barrier was down, crows walking on the moor looked whimsically at him. All manner of little creatures peered curiously to see who has come from the quarter whence so few ever came, to see who went on a journey whence so few ever returned, for the King of Elfland guarded his daughter well, as Alveric knew, although he knew not how. There was a merry sparkle of interest in all those little eyes, and a look that might mean warning. There was perhaps less mystery here than on our side of the boundary of twilight, for nothing lurked or seemed to lurk beyond great boles of oak, as in certain lights and seasons things may lurk in the fields we know. No strangeness hid on the far side of ridges, nothing haunted deep woods. Whatever might possibly lurk was clearly there to be seen. Whatever strangeness might be was spread in full sight of the traveller. Whatever might haunt deep woods lived there in the open day. And So strong lay the enchantment deep over all that land that not only did beasts and men guess each other's meanings well, but there seemed to be an understanding even that reached from men to trees and from trees to men. Lonely pine trees that Alveric passed now and then on the moor, their trunks glowing always with the ruddy light that they had got by magic from some old sunset, seemed to stand with their branches akimbo and lean over a little to look at him. It seemed almost as though they had not always been trees. Before enchantment had overtaken them there, it seemed they would tell him something. But Alveric heeded no warnings, either from beasts or trees, and strode away towards the enchanted wood. End of part 1. If you have been enjoying this audiobook, please take the time to subscribe. It would really help the station. If you could also like or leave a comment or share this station with other friends, that would be great. Thank you.